I work at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. We're the center that's putting on this talk, which is part of our larger seminar series this fall focused on cybersecurity and democracy. So thank you for coming, and we're very excited today to welcome David Dill. He is a professor, recently emeritus as of two weeks ago?
Yep.
And he is a part of the engineering and computer science departments at Stanford, and he spent the last 15 years of his career working on voting technology policy. And he is the founder of the Verified Voting Foundation and has worked a lot on sort of bridging the gap between the technical aspects of voting security and the political or policy-related aspects. So we're very excited to welcome him today. And I was just talking to him about fun facts, and apparently he went to a one-room schoolhouse for school in the 3rd and 4th grade. So a lot has changed, I guess, since then. And without further ado, we'd like to welcome David.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm not sure whether to be relieved or offended at the lack of protests, but the talk's not over yet. So in a nutshell, just to step all over my talk, I want to make the case that voting machine security is a question of national security, and that, thinking about that a little bit, right? Suppose you want to take over a country. You can build an army and mount an invasion and deal with the expense, difficulty, and various risks of doing that. Or if it's a democratic country, you could just elect your leadership team to run the country and save yourself a lot of trouble. And I think that's really the stark choice that we have to think about. And in this case, I think it would be a lot easier to take over the elections than to mount an invasion of the US mainland. And we ought to start thinking about defending our voting system in the same way we think about defending the rest of the country. So I'm going to talk about the problem, what I see as the solution, the current status of that solution, and the future. And I think this is a talk for general audiences. And I'm quite happy to entertain questions during the talk. If I feel like it's distracting us, I'll say, let's hold it till the end or whatever. But it may be that the best time to explain something is in the middle of the talk. And if you think that's the case, please ask. Okay, so we're now in an era of cyber war. We all keep hearing about this. And so that's because our society has increasing dependence on computers. So hacking becomes a useful military tactic in addition to bombarding, attacking with swords and horses, whatever the tradition is in the military. And the US government has been extremely worried about cyber war tactics for at least a decade, probably considerably longer than that. Many countries, including the US, are now developing offensive as well as defensive capabilities. And the targets could include telecommunications, both military and civilian, including the internet itself. Bringing down the internet would be devastating to the US for any length of time. Infrastructure such as the power grid, sewage treatment plants, etc. And elections, which is the topic I want to talk about. So let's talk about state-sponsored attacks. So it's increasingly suspected that these are happening. We know of some of them that are documented. So one of them is Stuxnet, the virus that damaged the Iranian uranium centrifuges, widely believed to be an Israeli and American product, although I don't think our government has officially claimed credit, if that's the right word. Probable Russian attacks on the Ukraine, including a virus that destroyed 80% of the Ukrainian D-30 howitzers, and an attack on the power grid that left 200,000 people without power, and attack on elections, which I think I'll mention later. So there was an attack against election equipment in the Ukraine, which involved sabotaging files and software on central election computers. There was a virus removed just before the election that would change how the outcome was reported. And there were denial of service attacks to block communication of the election results. So the goals of this attack were not necessarily clear. What's happening in the US is that accusations are made that there are general efforts to destabilize the country and undermine confidence in democracy. I think that we ought to also consider the much more direct goal of simply stealing the election and changing the outcome to get leaders that are regarded as better for a foreign entity running the government. So who really knows what was happening here? Maybe it was an attempt. I guess it was relatively obviously detected. So the supposed goal was to destabilize the Ukraine, but maybe they thought it would actually change the outcome of the election. And we've had, supposedly, Russian attacks on the US election. This is not certain, but entities within the federal government are claiming that this is happening. So there was selective email theft and publication of those emails damaging the Democratic Party, and illegal access of voter registration computers in several states for unknown goals. Supposedly there have been no changes in voter registration, but all statements like this are carefully worded to say there's no evidence of X. And I think there should be a distinction between there is no evidence of X and we don't know whether X happened. Because when you say there's no evidence of X, that suggests that some sort of investigation was conducted, and so far we've seen no evidence of any kind of in-depth investigation of any of these accusations. Furthermore, we don't know what else may have happened. So nobody has looked into the question of whether voting machines have hacked. It's another statement where somebody in the middle of a newspaper article will say there's no evidence that voting machines were hacked or that tallies were changed, and then the headline of the newspaper says tallies were not changed. Yes?
Is it okay to ask a question?
Yes.
Okay, so when you say evidence, so in a legal sense, there is no evidence. I understand that. But isn't there evidence in terms of the probabilistic aspects? There are certain states where just a few counties went just the right way to tally the entire state for Trump, and things that would be, from a probabilistic standpoint, not that likely, although it could happen. Have you looked at that aspect?
I'm not 100% familiar with all the statistical evidence on this, but I did see several news accounts, especially during the 3-state recount that happened after the election, which were erroneous. So you can't say one way or the other whether votes were changed, but the supposed statistical anomaly was not convincing. So other than that, I don't know. But I am not personally aware of there having been any convincing statistical evidence of an election of even in a county or a single jurisdiction having been stolen in this election by hacking voting machines. And there were several claims made, widely published, and I think they were either retracted or refuted. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, just means the statistical evidence is not there. Okay, so why would somebody attack an election? So the goals stated by the US government and the media have been to destabilize the country, discredit the democratic process. And many of the people stating these are aware of the doctrines, the military doctrines in other countries, such as Russia. And these are on their list of things that they might want to do. But I think we ought to consider the other possibility, which is control the results of the election, right? So you can fight the military or you can elect your chosen commander-in-chief. What do you want to do? Particularly destabilizing the US for any country sounds like a risky proposition. Because if a country is destabilized, you don't know what it's going to do. And when you have as many nuclear weapons and as big a military as we do, that seems like something that you would be very cautious about. So an obvious target if you're trying to take over a country is voting machines by cyber techniques. Almost all the votes in the US are counted by computer. Voting machines are easily hacked. Now, I think this is doable even if they're not easily hacked, because you really can't stop insider attacks by programmers at a voting machine company or something like that. But we've seen time and time again, if you just go to YouTube and start looking up cases of people demonstrating hacks on voting machines, including the latest things at DEF CON, where beginners were hacking the machines in just a matter of 10 minutes, you can see that security is not good on these machines. And the problem with voting is that tampering is almost impossible to detect unless you do a separate hand count of paper ballots. So there are machines, I'll talk about this more, that electronically count paper ballots, and then you can go back and check the original records and see if they agree with the electronic totals. So that's the solution that I'm going to recommend. But if you don't do that, you can't really have confidence in numbers produced by a machine except by comparing them with opinion polls or something. So we don't do auditing well enough. The Department of Homeland Security has said things, and this was a direct quote. They didn't see any increased level of malicious cyber attack activity aimed at disrupting our electoral process on election day. Now, if you don't read that carefully, you think, okay, great, nothing to worry about here. If you look at how carefully qualified this statement is, it's not saying very much, right? Maybe it didn't happen on election day, such as changing people's voter registration. Maybe it wasn't aimed at disrupting the electoral process. Maybe it was just aimed at changing the outcome and having a perfectly smoothly, an election that appears to be totally smooth, that produces a different outcome from what the voters selected. So we don't really know, and they're being very cagey about what amount of investigation has been done, although DHS representatives did testify in a Senate hearing that basically they did nothing by way of investigation. There may be intelligence agencies that have looked into this in more depth, but the results of these investigations, or whether they were conducted, are classified and are not being shared with us.
It also says on election day. Is that right?
Yes. So that's one of the things I mentioned. Things could happen before election day, right?
Oh, yeah. Things
can happen after election day, it turns out, too, but because a lot of ballots in California are actually counted after election day. I don't want to cast a lot of aspersions on the 2016 election because this has been true in all previous elections too. We haven't had the announcements of observed efforts to play with voter registration databases or whatever, but our election security has never been good, and I don't want to attack the outcome of the 2016 election in particular. We have a general problem with not having a strong basis for confidence in our election results. So why is this important? The role of elections in a democracy is not necessarily to convince the winners that they won, because they're easily convinced of that. The problem is convincing the losers that they lost, so they don't riot in the streets or overthrow what they regard as an illegitimate government. One of my favorite quotes here is from Dick Tuck, who is a political provocateur and congressional candidate in California, who gave the least gracious concession speech ever. The people have spoken, the bastards. But I like the quote because it says that even though you think the result was wrong, even though you don't like it, you have to accept it. So to get to that point, we need credibility of elections. So it's not sufficient for the outcome of the election to be completely accurate. It has to be demonstrably accurate. So there has to be some evidence. We have to have reason to have confidence in the election result, even if it's totally accurate. So if elections could be stolen, even if they're not stolen, if they could be stolen without detection, they're not credible. So who knows whether the result is right? Should we believe it? Well, if we don't like the result, maybe we would choose not to believe it. So there's a risk, right? I've heard California election officials say nobody would steal an election in California, but I disagree. Think about something like your car getting robbed, right? So if you have a really lousy car, then maybe you don't care. Maybe you'd be glad. Okay, if you have a very good car, then you're definitely going to lock the doors. So when you're thinking about risk, you should think about the motivations of the attacker. So what's the value of this thing? If you have a rational attacker, they're going to be more inclined to steal something that's valuable than to steal something that's worthless. All right, so with an election, what is control of the federal government, a state government, or even a county government worth? It's going to be, at the federal level, trillions of dollars. At the state level, billions. In California, even at the local level, in some of our bigger counties, it's going to be billions because of land use decisions that are made that can amount to that amount of money. And of course, power. Not everything that's valuable is measured in money. So who would the potential attackers be? Well, hackers, of course, people who do it for fun. Candidates and their supporters are willing to put tens of millions of dollars into campaigns. So if they're sufficiently unethical, they may be sufficiently motivated to, I mean, obviously the election is valuable to them. Zealots, people who believe that their political beliefs are more important than those opinions of the voters. But also foreign governments, which is what we've been talking about earlier, and criminal organizations, which can be very well funded, and obviously have a stake in things like law enforcement policy. So the point here is that the attackers may be very sophisticated and very well financed. Protecting elections is a lot bigger problem. They're a lot more valuable than, say, a jewelry store. Or almost anything when you're talking about the federal government. So the main point of the talk is that election security is now a national security issue. There are many ways to attack a country, and if it's a democratic country, attacking the elections is one of those, and possibly the most effective method, and we ought to be putting as much energy into defending our elections as into other aspects of national defense. We are not. Voting is an especially hard problem. So a lot of people, I've heard people talk about voting and say, well, the operating systems on the voting machines are old, they're not updated, every week like they're supposed to be. That's almost irrelevant. Voting is a different problem from a traditional computer security problem. So unlike almost every other secure system, with voting we have to discard vital information, namely the connection between the voter and the ballot that was cast. And so, according to our secret ballot system, no one except the voter should know how the voter voted. And the voter should not be able to prove, this is a subtle point that a lot of people don't understand about elections, even if a voter wants to prove how they voted to a third party, they should not be allowed to. That's because we don't want voters to be coerced by people threatening to break their knees if they didn't vote the approved way, or killed. And we don't want them to be bribed to vote a particular way. This is one case where we want to encourage fraud, right? So if somebody wants to pay me $20 to vote a particular way, and I bring them a fake ballot and collect my $20 even though I voted for the other candidate, that's good for democracy, okay? So we don't want me to be able to prove how I actually voted. This property is sometimes called non-coercibility or receipt-freeness, and I suppose you should forget that like everybody else does. But in the field, that's what it's called. So how well can we do? Well, one baseline to think is just paper ballots counted by hand. And so this was, at one point, a controversial method of dealing with votes when the secret ballot started. The Australian secret ballot was in the late 1800s, and at the time there were a lot of worries about fraud. And it's pretty much a brilliant system. It's not a computerized system, but it's a clever system for making sure the election results are trustworthy, even though the ballots are secret. Yes?
Question. Is it consistent with non-coercibility if I want to check to confirm that my vote was indeed registered a certain way 2 or 3 days after the election?
Unless you can find a way to do that where you can't also show somebody else how you voted and prove to them, right? I don't want to get too deeply into that, but the big problem is, several people have suggested to me, and one person even patented a scheme where you could look up your vote later to see if it was cast the way you wanted. And then if you didn't like it, you could complain or something like that, show the ballot to the authorities, and maybe they could detect election fraud. And the problem with that is you could also show the ballot to the person who's going to break your knees, if you didn't vote the right way. So there are clever cryptographic methods where you kind of check before you cast the ballot, but I'm not going to get into those, partly because my ability to explain them is quite limited. There are people at Berkeley who know all about this stuff. Okay, so the Australian secret ballot. You got paper ballots. The voters actually fill out the ballots, and certainly they can see what's written on the ballots. The ballot box is in public view, and the transportation and counting of the ballots are observed by political parties and election officials, and the poll workers themselves, who are the greatest source of security here. So it's a transparent system, and it relies on the physical security of the ballots to, and the fact that the voter can actually verify the contents of the ballot to make sure that the votes don't get changed. And then, so it's depending on physical security and transparency. This does have the advantage that everybody really understands paper ballots. And so if a ballot box disappears into a back room in the hands of a poll worker who emerges a while later with a smirk, they know that maybe something bad has happened. Okay, so if something goes wrong with a cryptographic key somewhere and the numbers don't match, it's going to be a while before people have a grip on what exactly that means for the integrity of the election. Yes?
But doesn't this also have a coercion problem where I can fill out my ballot, show it to somebody to confirm that they don't need to break any of these, and then they can put it into the ballot box?
It does, it does. And in the polling place, we have these voting booths and whatever, and laws about when somebody else is allowed to accompany a voter. It becomes a problem with vote by mail. And I think I'm not sure exactly how to grapple with that. I think that the problem can be reduced. You don't want sort of, there may be an issue within families, right? If you have an authoritarian parent or something, or what you really don't want is any kind of mass coercion, right? And so maybe in that case with penalties and incentives for reporting anything like that, we could deal with it. So for example, there are always accusations of coercion at nursing homes where they get a large number of ballots and somebody helps them vote, right? So, I'm not sure that the law is being adequately enforced there, but I think maybe it could be. Okay, so now we count ballots by computers almost everywhere. And so with voting machine security, we could try to ensure that the machines are 100% error and tamper-free. That means the hardware, the firmware, the software are all perfect. This relies on inspecting and testing the machines and the software and the designs. I work professionally in formal verification, which is checking the correctness of software. And we can find some bugs. For certain critical things, we can formally verify them. But I can assure you this is beyond the state of the art, just to check for correctness, much less malicious changes. So it might be good to have high-quality voting machines, but trying to assure security in this way is futile. It's hopeless. Let's not even do that. So the reason it's hopeless is program bugs. So that's the thing I've worked on the most in my career. Inspection and testing catch the easy problems, and only the obscure and unpredictable ones remain that disrupt voting every once in a while for unknown reasons. It's not good enough. And if you're talking about computer security, you're up against an adversary who is trying to find undetectable ways to make the program behave in the wrong way. So with computer security, how do we know that a system is secure? Suppose it is totally secure. How can we be assured that that's true? There's no way to demonstrate that. And what about attacks from insiders, the people who actually design the machine? A voting machine company costs more than an average California house, okay? But if we took a few of the houses on my street, it might exceed the cost that was paid, the price that was paid for Sequoia Systems maybe 10 years ago. So we don't even know who owns some of these companies. And then suppose you have an open source system and somehow people have figured out that it's perfect and it's totally secure, and then in practical terms, you can't really tell that it and the stuff underneath are what you wanted to be on the machine, right? You can have something that looks totally like the approved voting machine software, but is still malicious by somehow because it got corrupted or a perverse clone of that software was installed in the machine. And then you have all of this stuff inside the computer that none of us understand, including me. In fact, if you read about this stuff, you learn about horrific bugs because of things that manufacturers put in the machines, including Sun servers. No, this is the Intel. Yeah, I'm not going to rattle this off, but Intel actually put a separate processor on its server chips that people can hack into over the network undetectably, and they blew the password check, right? So this is an unwinnable battle. We can't just make the machine secure. And so I wanted to throw a few pictures in here. So if you go look on YouTube and whatever, you can see pictures of Andrew Appel, a professor at Princeton, hacking the voting machines that are used in New Jersey. You can see Pac-Man being played on an AVC Edge So this was the machine that used to be in Santa Clara County, where Stanford is, but they've gotten rid of them now. Okay, so what's the solution here? So I've said that making the machines secure is hopeless. The solution is to audit the machines. So you've got an employee that you don't trust, or maybe you think they're great, but you're not sure if you should trust them. The solution in business and finance is you audit people. And so you randomly sample their work and inspect it to make sure that you're not being embezzled from or something. And so the idea here is not to depend on computers for doing the auditing. You can use computers as much as you want to count votes, do record keeping, statistical analysis, whatever, but you need some method that doesn't depend on computers for spot checking the results to make sure they're accurate. So the best way we know how to do this, or maybe the only way, is to use a voter-verified paper ballot and to have the ballots deposited in a secure ballot box and kept physically secure, and then some sort of post-election audit that consists of randomly selecting and hand counting ballots to make sure that the electronic results match the paper ballots within some level of statistical confidence. So I'll mention here that the world's expert on this is Philip Stark at Berkeley in statistics. Okay, so what about paper ballots? Well, the most widely used technology in the US is optical scan paper ballots. And so we're already using the technology in 75% of the jurisdictions in the country. Most of the voters vote on them. Ballots are marked by hand. They're counted by machine. And if you have machines in the precincts, they can detect errors on the ballots right then and there and allow people to fix them, the voter to fix it, thus reducing erroneous votes. This is not a big leap for us since these are the systems we're using in most of the country now already. And then where we really need to improve our processes, we do have states where they're doing random auditing, but nobody's doing it well enough, and most states aren't doing it at all. So now we've got these great paper ballots and these machines that count them. We need to look at those paper ballots. And that's the reform that has to happen as soon as we possibly can make it happen. There are some pictures of optical scan machines. Let's see. My caption at the bottom, oh, this guy is an alumnus of your school. A proud alumnus. Okay, current status. Where do we stand now? We've got a lot of places where paper ballots are used. There are some notable exceptions, counties in Texas, including, unfortunately, Lubbock, which just bought a bunch of new ones. I didn't even think people sold these things anymore. But somehow in Texas, they managed to buy new electronic voting machines. Most of them are in places where they're aging out, which is good news for us. And hopefully, they'll be replaced by paper ballots. But there's still places like Georgia, where the entire state votes on electronic voting machines. So I feel like my efforts actually resulted in some of this, because in 2002, a lot of states were converting to electronic voting. And I think we mostly stopped that and made a national issue of it, so that became a lot less popular. Good. I've said all of those things. All right, so once you got the paper ballots, you got to count them. And so unfortunately, audits are not done as widely as they should be. Right now, there's an effort to water down audits in California. It's a bill called AB 840, and we would like the governor to veto it. California's about to make some negative progress there. There are a few other states. New Mexico does a pretty good job. Let's see, Minnesota does a decent job. But most states don't audit at all. Yes?
What makes New Mexico so good? Is it?
They actually passed a law because they had a good state-level activist group to audit. I don't remember the details, 5% of the ballots or whatever. They do a reasonably careful job of it. I still think it's not where we want to be, but it's one of the better states. Okay. Problems with audits. Sometimes the sample size is too small. In California, it's 1% of the precincts. It's the wrong way to measure it, and not a big enough number in most elections, except statewide elections. In some places, like Florida, they pick a race at random and audit that. That's not good enough. Sometimes the procedures are suboptimal, and always a problem with elections are procedures not being followed by people who don't fully understand why they're supposed to be doing what they're told to do. For one thing, when you say select at random, that does not mean pick the ones you like best. Random does not mean unconstrained. It means, probability distributions and all that sort of thing. Okay, good. So let's talk about the future. We need to start thinking about systematic defense of our elections. So this is a lot more than paper ballots, which is the particular issue that I'm focused on. But there are some easier problems in that I think maybe more conventional notions of computer security or just common sense measures can fix it by procedural changes. For example, checking that you don't have more votes cast than you have voters. That would be a good thing to do. So in a precinct, people sign in before they vote, compare the number of signatures to the number of actual ballots cast. And then vote totals get reported. The election results get reported from the precincts up a hierarchy to the county level and then to the state level. We want to make sure that the results reported at the county level and at the state level match what's actually on the ballots. And so just checking that the precinct level results are the ones that made it to the county and state level would be a very good thing to do, because that would be an especially easy way to change the number of votes, and there's an easy defense to it that is not always conducted. In election administration, generally developing and disseminating best practices would be useful. The thing that you have to explain to foreigners about the US election system is that it's hugely decentralized. And so there are many, many jurisdictions, each of which has somewhat different practices. A lot of them are understaffed and underfunded. And so if they have to do something very specific or detailed or hard, they have difficulty doing it. So sharing best practices among election jurisdictions would be a great thing. And enforce in regulation in the law what those best practices are supposed to be, and actually audit them to make sure that they're being followed. Defend our voter registration system. So the biggest threat is mass invalidation of people's voter registrations. They show up at the polls. They might be able to vote on a provisional ballot, but may not end up being counted. And so they've been disenfranchised. That's also a relatively straightforward computer security problem. It's going to take some effort and some coordination, but this is solvable by traditional approaches to computer security. And then for the paper ballots, risk limiting audits. So this is Philip Stark at Berkeley is one of the primary innovators here for working out the details of how to do this. There are a lot of them, but the idea with a risk limiting audit is to count a number of ballots that depends on how close the race is to achieve a guarantee within a certain probability that the outcome is correct. And so this ought to just be written into the law. So Colorado is, I guess, about to do these things, although there are still some difficulties with the way they're approaching it. And our goal would be to have these done nationwide as soon as possible. And it would have to be implemented at the state level, but have every voter, every election, have a risk limiting audit. The really best way to do a risk limiting audit would be to, when ballots are counted by a machine, to have them stamped with unique numbers, and then to randomly select the ballots and make sure that ballot number whatever matches an electronic copy of that ballot in the machine, and then publish somehow the ballot data, the electronic ballot data, so anybody can check that the numbers add up. This is incredibly efficient. So if you counted 1,000 or 2,000 ballots, you'd have a minuscule probability of failing to detect hacks or errors in the election, and it would be a lot easier than a lot of audits that people do now that are less effective. But it requires some technology changes. They're not hard, but they're not in existing voting machines. Okay, and then another thing to do is avoid doing stupid things in the future. So one of the stupid things that keeps coming up, and in fact I think maybe the majority of Americans not knowing any better would think, great, let's do this stupid thing, is internet voting. There were rumors that in 2016 that there was going to be an internet voting initiative on the California ballot, and I fear that that may have passed had it happened. Fortunately, the person who was going to fund getting it on the ballot got distracted. This is like DREs. Those are touchscreen machines with no paper ballots, but much, much worse. And the reason it's worse is people want to vote on like cell phones and home PCs. And then the attack surface, who can attack it and where they can attack from, is the entire world, not just people in the precinct or something. And then you're subject to all these attacks like phishing, where somebody sends you a helpful email or what address to go to vote, which happens not to be authentic, and they change your vote. And of course, the worst problem is malware on your computer. So people like it because the internet is cool, and so politicians are constantly proposing this. I heard somebody talking last night on the radio about health care in California, and saying, well, if people could just vote over the internet, they would feel empowered and they'd be more healthy, which I disagree with, both on health grounds and on security grounds. It's claimed to increase turnout, but if you actually look at the results in the places it's been tried, it doesn't increase turnout. Vote by mail, in general, does not increase turnout. Increasing turnout is hard because the main problem with turnout is that people don't care enough about voting. And so if you want to increase turnout, the one thing that probably would help is making voter registration easier. One of the most frequent reasons that people claim for not voting is they don't want to have to serve on juries, and they think that juror names are pulled out of the voter rolls, which they are in some places. So maybe we could fix that problem. But internet voting is not the way to increase voter participation. And of course, there are vendors, and you get bland assurances that everything is totally secure because magic. Okay, so my conclusions. The security needs of elections are different from most other problems. So, if you're a computer security person and you want to start thinking about elections, go also learn about elections too. Too many people running around with computer security credentials and no knowledge of elections saying blockchains will solve all our problems, right? And the people who know about blockchains and elections don't think so. We've got a serious threat here to national security because there's ample motivation for well-resourced attackers to go after our election systems. And in fact, if you wanted to attack the US, if you wanted to launch a military attack against the US, and you had some time to do it, this would be the most effective way of doing it. And so we've been talking about Russia, but the recent news about North Korea is that they stole all of the military plans from South Korea via computer hacking. So we're up against lots of adversaries who know how to hack. And so I think this is just a blind spot. It's like fortifying, you've got a castle with moats and alligators and giant doors and oak doors on the front and everything, but the back door is just open. And it's not a good way to keep your castle from getting invaded. Using computers to count ballots is okay, but you have to have a manual auditing process, or else you're basically handing over your election to hackers. And so this is doable, and I've been called a Luddite, because I oppose the use of computers in certain ways. That's not true. It's hard to be the Fubar Professor of computer science at Stanford and be a Luddite. I've worked on computer technology, including some far-out ideas my whole life, or ever since I first learned how to do it. I just think that if you're an engineer and a responsible engineer, you have to think about whether you're applying your technology to make the world a better place or a worse place. And you have to think about whether you're using the technology correctly. And, I wish more engineers thought this way. You have a responsibility to society to explain to people who don't necessarily have the technical knowledge that you do why something they want to do is a bad idea, or why they should implement a good idea. And I must say, I'm not too critical of engineers, because the voting problem is where at least people in computer science have really stepped up. So I started militating about this in 2003. And my nefarious plot was, I was going to spend a month and the problem would be solved. But after that didn't work out, my next plot was see how many other computer scientists I could get involved. And a lot of them got involved. And I'm at the point now where almost everybody has some area of expertise that's deeper than mine. There's really an incredible community of very prominent computer scientists and younger ones coming up who've helped out, whether it's at the national level or testifying by before Congress, or working within a local election office to try to help them do things better. The computer science community has been incredibly responsive and helpful in dealing with this issue. But there's been a big problem in getting the people outside the computer science community to really understand. And I think we still have to communicate this. Okay, so we've got more to do, and I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you. Yes?
So there have been a lot of efforts, especially here in California, to expand voter registration with automatic voter registration, etc. Do you think this stuff is also problematic with the electronic voter registration, or do you think this is still productive?
Well, I think I'm all in favor of making voter registration easier. I think people approach me with some degree of frequency with worries about online voter registration, the way it's specifically implemented. Because like a lot of companies and whatever, they try to authenticate you by asking for some personal information, right? Your driver's license number. But frequently that personal information is available to other people. And so one of my worries about the intrusions of voter registration systems that are being reported is that that's a way of getting the kind of information that people could use later to try to change people's addresses or unregister them. And so I think the voter registration problem needs real attention, but I think it's solvable. And I've dealt with unsolvable problems. I think the problem of trying to make a vote counting machine totally secure so that you don't have to have a paper ballot, that's not solvable with current technology. But the voter registration problem is solvable. It is something that we need to devote a lot of attention to on an urgent basis. Now, yes?
There seems to be an issue of attitudes in local governments towards hacking. So, for example, I was interviewing the information security officer for San Francisco government's election office, and he was, categorically denied that hacking could even be an issue, and that he doesn't want to devote any resources or time or effort into it. And so I'm just wondering whether there's been any work towards improving those attitudes and beliefs, or if you know what the best way to go about doing it.
Yeah, so the general problem is complacency. It's not just a problem in governments. And I don't think I have a solution to it. You can wait until they're horribly hacked, and then you have two effects. Either they become enlightened, or Darwin has an effect and somebody else gets the job, right? But that's a brutal way to do things. So yeah, I think you need to, there's a problem with psychology here. So people don't want to believe things that are scary and that make their jobs more difficult. And so to some extent, you need the right person with authority to speak. And sometimes I've discovered, although people should listen to computer scientists, they don't. And you're not in computer science, right? Yeah. So maybe you have an advantage there. But maybe they would listen to advice from the Secretary of State's office, or if you're talking about something that's not necessarily elections, right?
No, this was
state level government. Who do these people respect? So if they're talking to peers, and their peers tell the horror story of how their computer systems got destroyed, then maybe somebody will think, I'm next, and decide to change it. So one thing I would try in your position, maybe you've already done this, is to see what horror stories you can collect and share them. Or see if you can find somebody who's been through this, or somebody who's a credible peer, and have them talk to the individual and see how that goes. Organizing workshops and that sort of thing can be helpful. And of course, constructive advice. If somebody is in total denial about the problem, that's hard to get over. But a lot of times when people are in denial, it's because they think the problem is too difficult to deal with. And there have been claims that that's true with global warming, that people think the cost of dealing with global warming is so high that they don't want to say there's a problem, right? Okay, so with computer security, you say, well, I could admit that this is a problem, but then I'm not going to be able to do anything about it, and then I'll be on record having admitted that there's a problem, my machines get taken over, and so I'll look bad, as opposed to saying it's a complete surprise nobody could have predicted, right? Or I could do this, but then it's going to cost X million dollars to fix it, we don't have the budget, and so then what am I going to do, right? So if there's some like easier fix, that's all I can suggest. It's been a huge problem. I mean, that's my biggest problem, is election officials who don't think there's a problem. Yes?
There's no way we combine statistical methods and the random vote count, for example, to make it more cost efficient. So rather than just randomly picking districts to recount or something, we could actually use statistical methods to say these are the ones that are more likely, that we should more likely recount.
Oh.
Some way to make it more efficient is what I'm trying to.
Yeah. I don't think you want to start with a prior about which things are likely to be hacked, because your adversary knows that too. But maybe there's a way to do it. And the level of statistical sophistication here may not be impressive to a statistician, with the work that's already been done, but it is impressive to me as a non-statistician. So there's been some deep thought about this. So you should actually talk to somebody who's worked on the statistics of this to see, like Philip Stark. You had a question?
Yes, you seem to be opposed to internet voting. So
yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, so is there any new research in security that you'd like to see to happen before you feel comfortable with internet voting? Because it just seems so convenient.
Yeah, I'm not going to rule out that internet voting could someday be a trustworthy way to vote. But it's a long list of problems between us and there, including unsolved deep technical problems and social, political, and legal problems. So on the unsolved deep technical problems, how do we have devices that we can trust, right? So people with internet voting want to be able to vote on their cell phones or whatever, and if you're it's hard to make a case for doing anything on your smartphone that requires trust, because nobody knows how to secure these things. And particularly when you're up against adversaries, sometimes when you even prove things are secure, they find that you're wrong. And then in the social and political realm, suppose we have some clever cryptographic internet voting scheme that solves all of the problems, and then what it's going to do, it's not going to prevent the election from being hacked or whatever. What it's going to do is make it detectable. Okay, so you get to the end of your election, two numbers don't match. And you say, oh, the election is invalidated. Okay, so what do you do about that? Courts are currently notoriously reluctant to require that elections be rerun in the United States. And often the judges don't even understand the technical issues. So we have to get to a point where we've got laws that say exactly what has to be redone in a sufficiently unambiguous way that the judges are willing to enforce those laws and make the right thing happen with the elections. So those are just a couple of problems out of a long list. As to the convenience, voting by traditional methods is not particularly inconvenient. The worst thing is being allowed to vote because you're registered. And I myself have been in that situation where I moved, didn't get around to registering, and missed a chance to vote in an election because of it many years ago. So I believe that that's a real problem. Yes?
Question for you, and thank you for this talk. So I'm 100% convinced that it's possible to hack election machines. But if we think about elections, just starting from the national level inside the United States, there is, needless to say, a little bit of complexity for how those elections get conducted in the federal system. I mean, just some examples of that complexity would be, you've got different kinds of voting machines that are used in different precincts on a state-by-state and county-by-county basis. You could hack all you want in Rhode Island and it may not make a difference because Rhode Island only has so many electoral votes. You could bring all the political scientists and computer scientists you want together before an actual election takes place in the United States and ask them, almost in a red team format, which counties would you hack in which states in order to toss this election to candidate A versus candidate B? And I would imagine you would have very little
they could do that.
about how to do that. So even if you can hack the machines, what is your kind of point of view about the strategy that you would need to have in place so that the actual hack would make a difference?
Well, I think targeting, it would be a probabilistic thing. You wouldn't be guaranteed as a hacker of getting the outcome you wanted, probably. But I think in a presidential election, of course, not all elections are presidential elections, but let's talk about a presidential election. There are, you're right, a political scientist could identify, or somebody working at a campaign who does this professionally can identify counties and whatever that are going to be the deciding factor in an election. And they could be targeted. So I want to change the question a little bit. So one of the claims that's been made frequently, I see it all over the place in the media, is that our election system is so decentralized that nobody could hack the machines to steal the election. And I believe that's totally wrong. So first of all, the equipment is manufactured by a small number of manufacturers who have a small number of programmers working for them. Secondly, there are state and county election offices, depending on how your jurisdictions work, that install the software on the machines for the entire county or sometimes for the entire state. And so a small number of people could hack key counties or key states. Thirdly, there are contractors that basically deal with the equipment, and the same contractors serve many different counties within a geographic region, and so they could do it. And so those are at least 3 different like single points of failure, ways of attacking systems where a lot of votes could be changed in a key area by a small number of people. So the decentralization is not an argument for why this can't happen. One more question and we'll stop.
Is the argument that the blockchain people are making that the blockchain is immutable and that's why it's secure, or like what are they proposing?
I'm not clear on all of the blockchain schemes. I mean, the first obvious thing is it's in a ledger, and if you trust blockchains, and I'm not sure we're at the point where we should be trusting blockchains yet, it would be very nice to be able to post the votes on some sort of ledger and record them, and they could be encrypted or not, whatever. But that doesn't deal with the problem of the client, right? So if you're voting on a PC, then your PC is hacked, it changes the vote before it goes into the blockchain. And if you want to have a secret ballot, so you can't look up your vote in the blockchain ledger and show it to somebody else, then you've got, it's not clear to how to solve this problem. I think there are other people who are proposing to treat votes like currency and use Bitcoin in that way or something, but you've still got this client problem. In fact, if I'm using Bitcoin as currency, I would think twice about how about the security of my computer. So. Good. All right. Thank you all. And I'll stop there.
We just have a small gift. As a reminder, our next seminar is on Wednesday, November 1st. It's not at noon. It's at 4 p.m. And we're welcoming David Sanger, who's the chief Washington correspondent of the New York Times, to talk about just like the Silicon Valley DC divide. Tech policy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.